In my last video, I talked about the biggest mistakes I made when I started urban sketching as a retirement hobby last year. So what I've decided to do in today's video is to share the simple 5-step process that I've developed to help to minimise those mistakes. It helps me get the most I possibly can out of this rewarding pastime. So if you've been thinking about giving urban sketching a go, I'm sure you'll find this really helpful and it will get you off to the best possible start. But before we dive in, if you're new to the channel, my name's Gary Booth. I retired June 2025, age 62, after 44 years working in IT and business change. And I decided to set this channel up to record what I'm doing in retirement. So any new projects I undertake, any new hobbies I pick up, such as urban sketching, and just life in general in retirement. So if that sounds interesting, stick around. So let's dive into the simple 5-step process. Step 1 is to select your subject. And if I'm honest, it's probably my favourite part of the whole process. The reason being that it starts with taking lots and lots of photographs. So whenever I'm out and about, I'm always looking for something interesting to take a photograph of. I always have my iPhone with me, so it's quick and easy. My wife probably begs to differ. She gets sick of me saying, wait a minute, just let me take a picture of this doorway or whatever. But I enjoy it. It's interesting. And then, once I get back home, I make myself a coffee, I sit down and I scroll through my photo library to choose a subject to draw. So here's my subject selection process. It's no more complicated than scrolling through the photo album, deciding if I want to do that sketch or not. Now that looks a little bit too hard for me at my current ability level, as does that, even though I really like both photographs. That's probably something that is much easier for me to do, but it's a little bit dull. I'm not that interested in it. Now that could be quite good. And if you look at that, that's obviously part of a church. So I've not taken a photograph of the full church. I've zoomed in on this interesting doorway. And quite often what I do is I'll take a picture of the full scene, but then I'll crop it down to the bits I'm interested in. So this bit down here and this is the main focal point. The rest in the background will be there as shapes, but the detail will just be on this and the lamp, probably the railing and this stump here, not on the church and the roofs and the houses. And then finally, once I've selected the subjects, I'll stick with this one because that's the one I'm going to talk through. I just I keep it full size on my iPad, because the beauty of that is it's essentially the same size as my sketchpad or a page in my sketchpad. I don't need to adjust sizes up and down. It makes the sketching process that much simpler. Step 2 is the scariest part of the whole process for most people, myself included. It's where you're actually putting pen to paper. So you're starting with a blank sheet of paper, and the first thing you're worried about is, oh God, I don't want to make a mistake. So the way to get around that is to start with a very fine liner. So I use a 0.05, hold it very loosely and lightly sketch in the big shapes and the contours. Ignore the building as a whole, look for squares or circles or triangles and just get those in very, very lightly. Once you've done that and it's taking shape, swap to a slightly thicker fine liner. So I use a 0.3 and then I go in and I add some detail. So if it's a building, I'll have the windows, the doorways, and I'll retrace some of the lines. Some of the most important lines, I'll make them slightly thicker to make them more prominent. But I'm careful not to overdo it. I don't want to retrace every line. And then the final part of this step is to add some shading, and I do that with simple hatching. So if we have a look at the iPad, I'll show you exactly how I've done that. So the first thing I do in this step is I use my finest fine liner, which is a 0.05, and I just sketch in lightly and loosely the main shapes and contours. You won't be able to see these windows normally or some of the detail here on the memorial, but sadly I forgot to take a photograph when I'd done the first loose sketch. So that's what I do using this 0.05, and then what I do is I actually come in with a thicker fine liner, so a 0.3 in this instance, and I add in some of the detail like the windows, maybe some detail around the chimneys and these branches, the detail in the cross on the memorial, and I add some weight to some of the lines, some of the more prominent lines. And then once I've done that, the final thing I do in this step is I add shading, and I just use simple hatching and cross hatching to do that. So you can see where I want an heavier shadow, I use cross hatching, and here I've just used normal hatching. I've done the same on the roofs and the branches on the trees. Step 3 is where you get to splash some watercolour onto the page using a very watery mix of watercolour and a large brush. Now I typically use a 1/2 inch flat brush or a size 10 round brush, and I don't want to be too precise here. I don't want to overthink things. I just want to quickly and loosely get some colour onto the page. I always start with the sky, so I've got a very watery light blue mix here that I've quickly put onto the page. I can't remember if I use this large round or this flat brush. Both work equally as well, and I'm not too precise. I don't mind if bits of it go into these roofs, for example, but then once I've done that, I colour in the other main things with a light watery mix, so the memorial in this instance and the leaves on the branches. An important point to note is all this white space that I've left. I think I mentioned in my mistakes video that a mistake I used to make quite a lot was overworking things. Now if you leave plenty of white space, your sketch has a light, airy feel, which I particularly like. It doesn't look overworked. Once the loose wash is dry, I go back in with a much less watery mix of paint and smaller brushes, so typically I use a size 4 or a size 6 round brush, and I go in to pick out some key details to add some contrast. So this step is where you put in the key details. So if you look, previous step, I had that first wash of colour on there. Now what I want to do is go in and add some key details. So if we look here, I've got the red poppies, red brickwork in the background, more leaves. I think I've probably redone the roofs, bit more shadow down the side of the memorial, and I typically use a size 4 or size 6 round brush for this. Now one thing worth mentioning is there's two different schools of thought when it comes to whether it's acceptable in a watercolour for colours to bleed into each other. I'm not fussed either way personally. Sometimes I like it, sometimes I don't. So all I would say is if you do want colours to bleed into each other, for it to look a little bit looser, then don't wait for the first layer to completely dry. Go back in, add in the detail colours when it's slightly damp and you get a little bit of blurring. Don't do it when it's freshly painted because it'll just be a splodgy mess. If you don't like that, if you don't want it to bleed, let it dry completely before you do this final layer of watercolour. The final step, once everything is properly dry, is to go back in with one of your fine liners and to restate some key lines to provide a bit of definition, a bit of impact, to make things pop. But it's an optional step. I don't do this every time. I always have a look at the sketch and say, does it actually need me to fiddle around anymore, or is it done? It's very tempting to keep fiddling, and more often than not, when you do that, you completely ruin your sketch. Remember, less is more often than not. So in this final step, I go back in with my 0.3 fine liner, and I add a little bit of depth to some of the lines, some of the key lines on the sketch. I don't do everything. I focus mainly on the memorial here. Now, unfortunately, I forgot to take a photograph before I did that, so you'll have to take my word for it. But I did basically just focus on this part of the sketch. And the minute I got to the point where I was asking the question, should I do a little bit more? I know for me, that's the point to stop. Sign it, date it, and put my pen down. And I suggest you do the same. So there you have it. That's my simple urban sketching process. Now, if you sat there thinking, I'd love to give that a go, but I don't think I'm good enough, just ignore the inner critic. Everyone's got that. I felt like that when I started. And the reality is, a sketch that used to take me 3 hours 6 months ago now takes me less than an hour. You get better bit by bit, sketch by sketch, and the process definitely helps. So if you give this process a go, I'd love to hear how you get on. Alternatively, if you've got your own way of doing things, a different process, let me know about that as well. I'm always interested in new ideas, new ways of doing things. I'm always learning. If you've enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing to the channel. And until next time, take it easy.